Good afternoon. My name is Tristan Sanchez, and I'm going to be giving a presentation on my Wayne Williams project. So I'm going to be starting with an overview of my case of choice. So this is the case of Anthony Gray. Um, so basically, in October 1991, Anthony Gray, a man with mental impairments, entered a guilty plea to first degree murder and first-degree rape in Calvert County, Maryland. He received two concurrent life sentences. Police used statements from two other suspects who claimed Gray was involved to pressure him into confessing, although neither suspect had directly implicated him nor had Gray confessed on his own. Later, a defense attorney for one of the other suspects informed Gray that if he refused to testify, all three men would be released. Under this pressure, Gray accepted the advice and agreed to a plea, leading prosecutors to recommend a 30-year sentence. So here's a timeline of the Anthony Gray case. So in 1987, in 1987, the victim was, yeah, uh, the assault happened and the murder. And in 1990, two suspects arrested, and those are the suspects that implicated Anthony Gray. And in February 1991, Anthony Gray was arrested due to the pressure and his disabilities. He also had confessed, so yeah. In October of 1991, Gray pled guilty to first-degree murder and first-degree rape. He was sentenced to two consecutive life sentences despite having no evidence linking him to the crime. In 1999, Gray was released from prison after new evidence that was not available during his trial was tested, which proved him and the other two men not guilty. The evidence that was taken that proved him not guilty was semen from the crime scene that was tested for DNA. And this ruled out Gray and the two other men who were first detained, but it did match the actual burglary suspect. The official verdict for that the authorities gave was Gray was released after being wrongfully accused and convicted of the victim's rape and murder due to evidence that was not available during the trial. My personal verdict is I believe that Anthony Gray was not guilty because there was no evidence except for the words of the other two men that linked him to the crime. I also believe that wrongfully accusing people with the intent of harming should be a crime. And that's the overview for Anthony Gray. Next, I'm going to be talking about the historical context for Anthony Gray. So yeah, this case involves a lot of wrongful conviction that highlights issues of coerced confessions, racial bias, and systemic failures in the justice system. Anthony Gray was a African American male, and he had mental disabilities, and which the officers who interrogated him took advantage of and coerced him to confess to the crime. There was no evidence other than two other males, as stated before, who basically said things that linked Anthony Gray to the crime. And he spent 7 years in prison, and the DNA evidence that was found and tested after the trial exonerated Gray in 1999, revealing that he had no involvement in the crime. So the dates and era of the case, the date of the crime, the murder occurred in 1991 in Prince George's County, Maryland. The arrest was made shortly after the crime in 1991, and Anthony Gray was exonerated on April 27th of 1999 when DNA testing excluded him as a suspect and linked two other men to the murder, one of whom had already confessed to the murder. Relevant laws that affect the case. So, at the time, law enforcement in many jurisdictions placed significant weight on confessions, even when obtained under coercion. So, a lot of officers tended to just try to get a confession, even if they knew or just there was no evidence of the person being interrogated even being linked to the crime. And this practice of a lot of officers led to wrongful convictions. And by the late 1990s, improvements in forensic DNA analysis were becoming a critical tool for re-examining older cases. At the time of the trial, the technology had not yet been discovered, or I guess invented, to be able to test the DNA for Gray. There was a lot of improvements in forensic DNA analysis, which became a big tool and helped in Anthony Gray's case, and that overturned his conviction and got him exonerated. Influences of oppression. So Gray was an African American man in a predominantly white justice system, and he faced systemic biases that contributed to his wrongful conviction. Uh, Racial profiling and assumptions about his guiltiness likely played a role in law enforcement's targeting of him, and what also did play a big role was his mental disabilities. The case reflects broader issues of systemic oppression in the criminal justice system, including over-policing of black communities, the presumption of guilt, and insufficient safeguards against coerced confessions. These are some statistics of the time. So incarceration rates in the early 1990s, the U.S. incarceration rate was climbing sharply due to tough on-crime policies. African Americans, who made up roughly 12% of the population, made up nearly 40% of the prison population. There was a lot of economic disparities. So during the 1990s, Black Americans experienced very high poverty rates, and this limited access to a quality legal representation. And there was also a lot of wrongful convictions. So studies at the time showed that African Americans made up a large number of those wrongfully convicted, and it was confirmed by research organizations like the Innocence Project, which found that 69% of wrongful convictions overturned by DNA evidence involved Black individuals. The media presence around the case, unlike high-profile cases such as the Wayne Williams trial, which we'll be talking about later in the presentation, Gray's case received minimal media attention, and the lack of widespread coverage shows a lot of issues in the system in prioritizing stories of racial injustice. Gray's exoneration brought some attention to the flaws in the justice system, particularly the issue of coerced confessions. His case became an example in discussions about criminal justice reform. After his release, organizations like the Innocence Project use cases like Gray's to advocate for changes in interrogation practices and greater looks into evidence in criminal cases. Alright, so next we're going to be talking about the Wayne Williams case. This is going to be a quick overview. So the Wayne Williams case is centered in the city of Atlanta, Georgia. Wayne Williams became a suspect in 1981 when police found the body of Nathaniel Cater. There were multiple fibers from Williams' home, car, and clothing found on multiple victims, leading to his arrest. Williams was convicted for the murders of 2 adult victims, Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, but there was speculations he was linked to multiple other children's murders. Williams was sentenced to 2 life terms in jail. So this is a timeline of the Wayne Williams case. So in 1979, the 2 children were murdered. In 1980, investigations got rigorous as the FBI joins the investigation. In 1981, Wayne Williams was arrested and charged with the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. In 1982, the trial begins in Atlanta. The prosecutors rely heavily on fiber evidence found on the victim that matched with Williams' home, car, and clothing. And currently in 2024, Williams is still serving time in prison. The official verdict of the authorities was that he was found guilty by the jury for the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. Williams received 2 consecutive life terms in prison. The jury strongly relied on the fiber evidence linking him to other murders. My personal verdict is I believe that he was guilty, but I don't believe that there was enough evidence to convict him in court. Fibers and hair evidence tend to be a class evidence, so that doesn't link to one specific person. And it's not enough to narrow it down. Yeah. It's not enough to narrow it down to one singular person. If I were the lawyers, I would have tried to make an argument about Williams being seen staking out body dump sites. So this was evidence that was used to convict Wayne Williams. So there were fibers from his car, fibers from his bedspread, and possibly Williams' hair, fibers from a blanket under Williams' bed, blood in the back seat of Williams' car, and a flyer distributed by Williams. So here is a timeline, pretty much, of the Wayne Williams case. So the killings occurred between July 1979 and May 1981. Wayne Williams was arrested on June 21st of 1981. The trial began on January 6th of 1982 and concluded with a conviction on February 27th of 1982. So these are relevant laws affecting the case. So this case was groundbreaking in its use of forensic fiber evidence to link a suspect to multiple crime scenes. At the time, forensic science was still developing, and fiber analysis played a huge role in securing Williams' conviction. However, the reliability of fiber evidence without showing direct evidence has been a point of controversy. In Georgia, during the 1980s, the death penalty was a common sentence for murder. But by only charging him with the murders of the adult, prosecutors avoided the challenges of convicting him for child murders, which may have required more concrete evidence. So the influences of repression. The killings highlighted systemic racial inequities. Atlanta's African American community felt neglected, as many believe that the slow police response due to the victim's race and socioeconomic status. Authorities faced immense pressure to solve the case. This led to some arguments that William became a convenient scapegoat due to public demand for swift justice. So these are some statistics of the time. So during the late 1970s and early 1980s, the U.S. incarceration rate was rising due to the war on drugs and increased sentencing severity. African Americans were disproportionately represented and accounting for about 40% of the prison population, despite being less than 13% of the U.S. population. In the early 1980s, nearly 50% of African American children lived below the poverty line, and access to welfare and healthcare was limited, especially in southern states like Georgia. And this is where systemic disparities in public services affected Black communities. So this is the media presence around the case. So the Atlanta child murders received extensive media attention due to the shocking nature of the crimes and the racial dynamics involved. A lot of news outlets like New York Times, like the New York Times, covered the story, bringing unprecedented focus to Atlanta. The case inspired a lot of documentaries and books, such as the Atlanta child murders, and was heavily discussed in books and investigative journalism. This case did bring a lot of skeptical reporting. Some media outlets accepted the official narrative of Williams' guilt. Others questioned the adequacy of the evidence and highlighted discrepancies in the investigation. The case also spurred rumors and conspiracy theories, including suspicions of the Ku Klux Klan involvement, further complicating public perception. So next we're going to be talking about the scientific method. So the scientific method is a way that scientists figure out how things work. It starts with observing something and then asking a question about that something, and then questioning. Through the question, you create a hypothesis, and on that hypothesis, you experiment, and then analyze the data that comes out of that experiment, and then you draw a conclusion from that data, and cycle repeats. So the Wayne Williams case shows how important ethical practices are in how. So the Wayne Williams case shows how important ethical practices are in forensic science. Ensuring accurate methods and avoiding bias, being transparent, updating techniques with new advancements are a huge key to ensuring justice. Failing to follow these standards can lead to wrongful convictions or reduce trust in the legal system. In this case, questions about the forensic evidence continue to spark debates about Williams' guilt and the role of forensic science. By following the scientific process more rigorously, the investigation could have built a stronger, unbiased case, and this approach would increase public confidence, reduce controversy, and provide clearer answers about Williams' involvement. A smoother process would also make it easier to revisit the case with new techniques, ensuring justice in the long term.